Peace, love, and constructive discomfort, my friends. My name is Jim, and today I'm going to be posting a video to try to take some thoughts that have been sort of floating around a bit in my head and begin to take the threads that connect these thoughts to draw them tightly together in a nice package and hopefully coalesce some of this into something that makes any sense to anyone, including me. So thanks for indulging me as I go through this process. What I'd like to talk a little bit about today is remote viewing, and particularly talking about the legacy of remote viewing, and to share some thoughts on how remote viewing may be contextualized in a much broader picture and what that might mean for us. So, I'm going to start off with a foundational assumption here that you already know what remote viewing is. If that's not the case, then please forgive me. I've included some links below to some blog posts I put up to talk about remote viewing, how I got involved in remote viewing. Definitely check those out if you're interested in it. You can learn how remote viewing kicked my ass, changed my whole view of reality, and began to change me as well. But because you're all here, I'm going to assume that you have been searching for weird things, so welcome. We're a kindred spirit. And I'm also going to assume that you have some foundational understanding about what remote viewing is. I'm not going to get into that. So what I've been thinking about has really been, for many of us who got involved in remote viewing, where did remote viewing come from? What were the intentions behind it? And what are some of the consequences that we may not have thought about that were part of the legacy that we received from folks who started off doing remote viewing? So if you think about remote viewing and you think about its background, you don't have to go very far. You just have to listen to the terminology a lot of times that we use in remote viewing to understand it comes from a military background, an intelligence collection background. So for example, we talk about targets, we talk about data, we use very contemporary terms, we might talk about coordinates. And this is really a reflection, of course, of what remote viewing was designed for by the Stanford Research Institute and by Ingo Swann when he was involved in that effort, along with many others. But what it was designed for is, being able to take a group of soldiers, being able to expose them to psychic function to get them up and running relatively quickly, and to give them a consistent methodology so they can begin to bring some of the noise down from psi functioning to be able to produce valuable intelligence products. And so what that really means, think about the questions that they were getting asked, so how do I kill the enemy, right? Where's the enemy located? How are the hostages? Are they alive? What's their health condition? What are the Russians up to? Are they designing some new nuclear sub that we need to know about? So if we think about these kinds of questions and we think about remote viewing, one of the things that we can take away from this is this focus during this time was very externalized. So, meaning, if you think about what remote viewing was doing, it was meant to go out into the world to be able to collect information non-locally about things that were happening in different spaces, different times, and bring those back to be able to feed them into an intelligence channel for analysis, and to be able to finally get that analysis to decision makers to do something about it, right? What's interesting, though, is you can almost take this perspective that remote viewing and psychic functioning was really all discovered in the 1970s, right? So Stanford Research Institute got together, they saw the Russians were doing something, and they're like, holy shit, psychic functioning is real. But of course, that's completely wrong, right? It lacks a complete understanding of our broad human history. And once you begin to read a little bit about psychic functioning and you look in our spiritual traditions, for instance, really just look in Indic spiritual traditions. So you have Buddhism, you have Hinduism, you have Jainism, and you start to read some of the literature that was involved for thousands of years in these religions, and you quickly realize, well, holy shit, they really understood that if you're meditating, if you're cultivating these different states of consciousness, that you begin to have non-local awareness, and you begin to be able to perceive things at a distance, just like we do with remote viewing. But the interesting contrast is if you look at remote viewing and this contemporary idea of remote viewing and you compare it to these ancient traditions, remote viewing has that externalized focus, whereas the spiritual traditions really are not trying to utilize this non-local awareness. They're really looking at it as more of indicative of the development of an individual. So what do I mean by that? If you look at these texts, what they're basically saying is the greater you expand your consciousness, the more aware that you become of what's real, of who you are, that these superpowers literally begin to emerge, and they are almost gauge marks, if you will, to have a sense about where you are in your total understanding, your realization of what's real and what's illusion. And so these are diametrically opposed. Remote viewing is like, holy shit, this thing works. Now, how can we heal people with it? And on the other hand, we have these internalized practices where it was, don't get distracted by it, right? These are signs that you're approaching something very valuable, which is a true insight into how the universe works and who you are. And so there's a tension here that exists between contemporary remote viewing and these ancient traditions, and one that we really didn't receive. So if you think about those of us who came to psychic functioning through remote viewing, like myself, what we received is a set of methodology and this idea like, go forth and do this, and some weird shit's going to happen, and you're going to be able to see through time and space, which we did. And we're like, holy shit, this works, right? And for me, I became obsessed with it. I've been doing a lot of remote viewing. But what was left out of any of that, if you go back to these earlier traditions, was all the instruction manuals, if you will, around all the other shit that happens when you start to have these realizations about what's really real and what's not. And to give an example, there's a lot of remote viewing books by really well-known individuals that I love. So when I got into remote viewing, of course, you get a massive library of things. You start to read a lot. And these books sometimes are written very professionally. They're written very procedurally. And you can take away a lot by going through step, like what they did, what their practices were like, how they meditated, etc. But the really amusing thing is you get to the end of these books, and at the very end, they're like, and by the way, when you're doing all this stuff, you may encounter spirits. And if you do, they may be helpful and they may not be, just roll with it. Or here's some things you might need to do to psychically defend yourself as you're remote viewing. So, which are basically like spells. So if you look at this, it's really amusing to me because on one hand, like, you're acknowledging that you can see through space and time, right? And you're out there about that. You're willing to write about it. On the other hand, it's almost like an embarrassment that you put all this other stuff so far back in the appendix you can't find it about spirits and magical spells to protect yourself from psychic attacks. My point in saying any of this is, it feels like we got part of the package in remote viewing, but we didn't get the whole thing. It's like they lifted out one section of the mage's spellbook and gave us a few pieces of paper about that, but they left out all the other stuff. And what that's been making me consider is, as I've been not just doing remote viewing, but interested in psychic functioning in general and how it can be utilized, how it can be cultivated, is what does it mean? Like, how did we perceive these things throughout most of our human traditions that recognize them? And so what I've really been thinking about is, as we've kind of cultivated and we've used scientific terms to talk about remote viewing, and we talk about quantum holograms, and this is all great, but one thing we're really lacking sometimes is that historical understanding about how people thought about psychic functioning and what sort of other practices were associated with it that seemed to be important to people based on thousands of years of human experience. So I think that's important. I intend to really, this next coming year, that's one of my main areas of focus, is to garner a better understanding of that. But I think the other thing is, it stands as a question for us. If you look at these previous traditions that were dealing with clairvoyance and dealing with, in some cases, protocols for structured clairvoyance, what were they perceiving that they were doing? And how were they using clairvoyance at all? And increasingly, my own experience with remote viewing has not just been in isolation. And so, I want to be honest about things, and I want to talk about them clearly because I think it's important. So when I got into remote viewing, it wasn't just remote viewing that I was experiencing, trying to deal with the epistemic shock of understanding that time and space may not be what I think they are. I had all kinds of other stuff going on, and I won't go into this video on all those other things, but those things in many ways were more challenging to me and my idea of reality than remote viewing ever was. And so remote viewing actually felt kind of the easy thing to do. But it also seemed to be the causative thing. Like, the more I would do these utilize psychic functioning, the more this other strange aspects in my life were occurring. And it seems to be that there's a really strong correlation between utilization of psychic functioning and some of these other phenomenon and phenomenology. So I think this may be important. I think that we need to think about maybe reconstructing a fuller manual. Those of us who are remote viewers, are we really doing remote viewing in the context of thousands of years of experience of folks who found other things that were really useful? And what I've noticed is a lot of practitioners who I've met, they don't necessarily talk about this, but they've really augmented things for themselves. So as they ran into issues, as they ran into, quite honestly, problems, they made up stuff, or they invented stuff, or they went and copied something. And so in many cases, we kind of have these ad hoc instruction manuals or personal things that people have learned that they've kind of stitched together that they know is really useful. And so I think that tells us a lot that we're missing a lot of this picture. And when we choose to be psychic practitioners, that we need to take into a broader picture of history and understanding and appreciation of what that history tells us. So that was my long-winded ramble. Thank you for sticking it out with me. If this is interesting to you, or you have any thoughts about it, please feel free to leave some comments down below for me. I would love to hear from you and hear your thoughts. And until next time, I hope you stay very weird. I hope you stay very curious, and I hope you stay very blessed. Take care.